So we would like to acknowledge that Trent University is on the land and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga, adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory, and in the territory covered by the Williams Treaty. We say miigwech to all the people who have come before us and taken care of these sacred lands and waters, and to those who know it's everyone's responsibility now. We are all treaty people. And I'll pass it back to you, Kat.
Lovely, thank you, Steph. Hello, everybody. All right, just having a little bit of an issue. I need to pin myself. There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Enwayaang. Here in Gzowski, the name of our building is Enwayaang, which means the way that we speak together. Enwayaang in the past has been a yearly event, but this year, amid the changes, we have been doing weekly passionate talks by Trent community members. This week, we are talking to Joel Baetz about the rise of comics, why they matter, and what they say. Joel Baetz is an associate professor of teaching in the Department of English Literature and is the director of Trent's Center for Teaching and Learning. His teaching has been eclectic, covering topics such as adaptations of Shakespeare, Toronto literature, and 21st century Canadian poetry. His writing has a similar range. He has published essays on a number of topics, from the representation of cricket in the collection of short stories to renditions of cultural absence in popular Canadian novels to formations of urban memory in a recent novel about Toronto. His book on Canadian First World poetry was published 2 years ago. He's also a recent winner of the Symons Award for Excellence teaching here at Trent University. Thank you, Joel, for joining us in Enwayaang this week.
Oh gosh, Kat, that's a lovely introduction, and thanks so much for having me. I was so pleased to get this invitation, and it's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces, but also meet some new friends today. So I'm very grateful to be here, and I want to talk with you about what has turned into a kind of research sideline for me for quite a while now. I've been thinking a lot about comics, comic book history, what they mean, how we should read them, why we should pay attention to them, and I wanted to share that with you today. So at Kat's suggestion, I put together a rather informal talk it's about 20 minutes in length, I think. We'll see how it goes. About 20 minutes in length that its first part describes sort of my interest in comics, sort of a general interest and look at comic book history. And then I want to zero in on one particular text that I keep coming back to. And it's a kind of, I want to say canonical text. It's no less essential to the development of comic book history than, say, The Great Gatsby is to American literature. So I want to come back to one particular text, or zero in on one particular text in the second half of my talk, and that's Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. So it's one of the first Batman graphic novels, and I want to explain or try to explain my interest in it, and try to show you why I find it so fascinating, and what it makes me think about when it comes to 1980s American political culture, and the way in which these texts, dismissed as juvenilia, dismissed as something that's just entertainment for kids, well, those texts actually are potent with meaning. So that's the general shape of my talk. And then hopefully, if all goes well, hopefully we have lots of time for questions and discussions in the second half of this hour. Okay, so that's the general shape for today. Now, Kat said to me that usually when we get together when we're able to be in the same physical space, that it's informal and there's no pictures, there's no ITUs. But since I'm talking about comics and visual texts, I did put some slides together. I know there's nothing more soul destroying than someone saying, "Oh yes, and I have a few slides for you all," but I have a few slides for you all. But they're sort of essential, right? I could act out maybe some of these slides and some of these panels, but they would be far less interesting. So I am going to show you some slides, and hopefully I've delayed enough that I now have sharing capabilities in order to share my screen. Thank you, Kat. I'm going to just, I've been in Zoom, probably 1,000 times now, and it's still not totally natural. I still have to make sure I'm looking around my screen to make sure. So I do want to point out, I'll come back to this cover in a minute, but I just want to point out a few things that's interesting about this cover. This was before Frank Miller, and that's the author that I want to focus on in a few minutes, before Frank Miller was given the reins of Batman in the mid 1980s. Sam, 1980s was a long, long time ago where your dad had a full head of hair. And back in the 1980s, before he got Frank Miller's The Dark Knight, before he got Batman, he was first allowed to work with Daredevil. The really interesting thing about Daredevil, or at least this cover here, is that there's nowhere in this comic book where Daredevil actually holds a gun, right? So this is a cover image only. And so it would be important for us, I think helpful for us, at least helpful for me as a reader, to think about, well, what does it mean that he has this gun? Who or what is he pointing it at? And we'll come back to that in a moment, because I think it's really, there are some interesting answers that are possible. When I was growing up, when I was your age, when I was growing up, I owned 2 comic books as a kid. My parents, one year, I think when I was 9 or 10, for Easter of all holidays, had given me an A-Team comic book. I don't know why, what Easter and A-Team had to do with one another, but it showed up on Easter morning. So that was one comic book that I had as a kid. And the second comic book that I had as a kid was an Archie comic that I think I pilfered from a friend's cottage at some point in my early teens. So I only owned 2 comic books as a kid. I had a friend named Max Piesner. Max Piesner lived down the street, and he had only comic books in his house. He had comic books and video games. And even then, I wasn't that much interested in comic books. I'd sort of flip through them a bit and see, you know, it's Electro and Spider-Man, and okay, but I was really interested in the ads at the back, you know, for the X-ray goggles, or for, you know, how to get strong really quickly. I was more interested in those ads. And then when I was a graduate student, when I was a PhD student, I needed some brain candy, right? So one of the things that they have you do when you're a PhD student is you write your comprehensive exams. And you go away, they say, here's a list of 100 books or so, and come back and we'll give you, and we'll test you on them. So there's a 2 or 3 day exam on those texts. And I was eating a steady diet of vegetables during the day, all that reading that I had to do from that list of 100 books. And I needed some brain candy at night, to sort of what I thought to be simple entertainment, to distract me from the really healthy diet of reading that I was having during the day. And so I started to get really interested in comic books and in graphic novels. And that's where I started to discover that comic books and graphic novels aren't just simple entertainment. They might have been dismissed as texts that are just for kids, juvenilia, easily dismissible. But they're far more complex than that. In the same way that movie and film were dismissed as, well, just entertainment for the working classes, or just something that, quote unquote, women did during the day. That's how novels were thought of at the very beginning of their generic history. Comic books were dismissed as well. They were dismissed as being just for kids. They were children's entertainment. But what I discovered, even though I was looking at them first as a kind of brain candy to distract my mind, I discovered that they were actually, or I encountered them as an archive of American history that was hidden in plain sight. I think it's possible to see some key moments in American history by reading comic books. So we could say, for example, this is one of the very first American comics, and it's The Yellow Kid. So what's interesting about The Yellow Kid, this is Richard Utcult, 1896. Richard Utcult also goes, this is also for those of us old enough to remember Buster Brown. Richard Utcult invents Buster Brown after he does The Yellow Kid. And so he writes The Yellow Kid. You can see The Yellow Kid down here in the front part of the panel. And these were single page comics that were in New York newspapers. And you can see also the ways in which the Yellow Kid, or Richard Utcult, is trying to figure out how to integrate text and pictures here. And so he doesn't, speech bubbles have not, quote unquote, been invented yet. Instead, all his writing is on his shirt. I think about this too when I'm watching people text in movies, right? People are still figuring out how to get texting on screen, and there's a weird management of it. So too here, they're still thinking about, and usually the yellow kid, he's down here in this particular panel, what they did to the dog catcher in Hogan's Alley, and he's usually pointing back behind him and saying, "Look at all this kookiness in late 19th century New York tenements." So it's very much an urban comic where other people were writing about the amber waves of grain that you could see from the tops of American mountains. Richard Uckalt was going into the cities and documenting their violence, their joy, their kookiness. You can see the name of this particular character escapes me off the top of my head, but he's Kenny from South Park before Kenny from South Park. This kid falls or dies almost every panel or almost every comic, right? He's sort of like that hidden gem, that Where's Waldo there. So you can see this moment of American tenement or urban history in Richard Uckalt's late 19th century comic. Here's Little Orphan Annie, and Little Orphan Annie is sort of a staunch advocate of middle American values, but she is also an incredibly conservative icon, an anti-New Deal, gives voice to anti-New Deal politics. So where the American government was inventing the New Deal, a kind of social welfare state. Little Orphan Annie was walking around during the Great Depression telling farmers who were suffering because their fields were laid waste by the drought, telling farmers that all they had to do was just work harder and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and they wouldn't be a drain on other taxpayers. So she's in some ways the first superhero, but she's also very much an anti-New Deal icon. We could think about in American magazine culture, there's the rise of popular existentialism, right? So what do you do if you're not sure that you're going to be saved? What's here for us in the universe? And Peanuts, both Linus and Charlie Brown, take on those particular ideas as they wait for the great pumpkin, or they consider what's the point of it all if someone's just going to remove the football when I try to kick it. If we're going to read Waiting for Godot as an existentialist text, so too we should read Peanuts in the same way. And it coincides with the rise of popular existentialism in American culture. Here's Robert Crumb's 1970s underground comics. This is probably the tamest, the most Sam-friendly version of comics by Robert Crumb. Very much about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, explicit sex, explicit drugs, and sure, explicit rock and roll, if there is such a thing. And so we can see sort of the rise of that underground culture rise up through Robert Crumb's texts. And I encountered these ideas as I read as a graduate student. I was able to TA a wonderful course, and a lot of these ideas were given to me. I arrived at through discussions by TAing a course with Jonathan Warren at York University. And I had the pleasure to add to these ideas and make them more meaningful to me. And I also had a chance to think more about Frank Miller and The Dark Knight Returns. And that's what I want to share with you today. I want to share with you the ways in which Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, well, speaks to another political or historical moment in American history. And I think you'll start to see why or what I mean as I move through these texts. The Dark Knight Returns comes from what we might think of as an annus mirabilis. So if you study Anglo-American modernism, you know that 1922 is usually talked about as a wonderful year, an annus mirabilis. Really important texts were either published or created in that year. Mrs. Dalloway, Ulysses, The Wasteland. Well, when it comes to comic book history, 1986 is an annus mirabilis because Mouse gets published, so too does Watchmen, and so too does Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. So it's this year of really wonderful creativity And also we're seeing a rise in popularity. Now, I could talk at length, or maybe in the question period, about what accounts for that rise in popularity at that time for these particular texts. It signals a shift in who was allowed to write, so who was allowed to be the authors, and also how they were sold, right? So both the production and the distribution of these texts. But what I'm most interested in today in sharing with you is what Frank Miller was allowed to do with Batman. Now, one of the things that you should know about Batman is that we might think of him as a kind of flexible signifier, right? That sure, there are traits that Batman has that no author could ever deviate from, right? Because he has to be recognizable as Batman. But we still get many different versions of who Batman is, and also what kind of cultural moments he's able to speak to. Here's Batman the inventor. I just love that somehow somebody figured that they could work in the Bat Gyro into a comic. Batman the detective, he was also very early on, he was a kind of Sherlock Holmes. So he comes out, goes sort of Dick Tracy, and then Batman picks up on that kind of detective capability. So he's often sort of playing detective. This is one of my favorite panels of all time. This picks up on, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but audiences and authors and politicians and some super concerned, super conservative parents were always worried that there was a gay relationship, a queer relationship between Batman and Robin. And you can see how that's talked about here. I'm not sure. I can't see it because of the shared screen, but he'll be too busy with his home life. Yeah, I wonder why he's doing it. I never thought he'd fall for a girl, right? The acknowledgement here is that there is a queer history to Batman that's being acknowledged, and you can see it also written on Robin's face. Like, why ever would he want to get married to someone else? He has me the whole time. So there's reluctantly married Batman. There's hyper-normal Batman, so sometimes a response to some of these, I'll say accusations. Accusations about Batman being gay or having a relationship with Robin is that he suddenly gets a girlfriend to prove that he's not gay in any way, right? To assure their conservative readers, their homophobic readers, that everything is all right between the two of them. There's alien Batman, wartime Batman, vampire Batman in the 1970s. There's 9/11 Batman, right? This is the first Christopher Nolan movie. I always think of that as a 9/11 movie. After all, the plot is that there is some shadowy threat that exists beyond Gotham City. They want, and that shadowy threat believes that Gotham City is a city of moral turpitude and wants to take it down. How does it want to take down that city? Well, by driving a vehicle into the tallest tower in Gotham City that's stand-in for New York. Only Batman saves the day. And there's the moment right afterwards where Batman's walking around the ruins of Wayne Manor saying, how could we rebuild? Sorry, that was my Christian Bale imitation. How could we rebuild? Right? Wondering how could we rebuild these towers after 9/11, after these edifices have fallen. So this is really 9/11 Batman. And then I want to think about and talk more about Frank Miller's Batman in 1986, because there is a political component here. Batman in Frank Miller's hands is a political revolutionary. And that's striking to say so out loud. And it's striking to think about Batman as a political revolutionary, because it was strange at the time for superheroes to have that kind of function. What had happened in the 1950s was, well, there were a lot of concerned parents. And chief among, or main among those, pardon my language, main among those concerned parents was Frederick Wortham, who was a psychologist. And so there was a 1954 Senate subcommittee on juvenile delinquency. And one or part of their time was spent talking about how comics were turning children delinquent, too violent, too explicit. You can think of the kind of comics they were talking about. They were talking about Tales from the Crypt comics, EC comics that were risky, horrific, that were very violent. But there was also some time that Frederick Wortham spent talking about superheroes and how violent they were, how explicit they were, how they took aim at authority. And also he talked a fair bit about the relationship between Batman and Robin, right? That what was a grown man like Batman doing with a young man like Robin going out at night all the time? And so the result of that Senate subcommittee in 1954 was the Comics Code Authority. You can see the sticker on the bottom right-hand corner there. And there was sort of a self-policing agreement. So the comic book industry said, whoa, we don't want anyone to police us. We'll police ourselves, and we'll come up with this list of things that we will not show anymore. And you can see crimes will never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, and policemen, judges, government officials shall never be presented in a way that disrespects their authority. Well, when Frank Miller was asked to take over, or when he had the opportunity to take over Batman, this is what he ignored. He ignored the Comics Code Authority. And so if we can return to Daredevil, what is Daredevil taking aim at here? Sure, we could say, oh, he's taking aim at a really bad Ben Affleck movie in the future, maybe. Or he's taking aim at the reader, trying to lob a bullet and shock them, but maybe. I always like to think that we could draw a line to that Comics Code sticker in the top right-hand corner. What is he really taking aim at? What does Frank Miller want to take aim at when he writes comics? The Comics Code Authority that polices what he can say and what he can do. And what we have in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns is we have a Batman who fights police officers, who speaks out and takes on, well, Superman for sure, but also Superman's friend, Ronald Reagan, in the third book of this graphic novel. And sure, there's that kind of explicit political fight or dimension to The Dark Knight Returns. But it's also, I think, more complex than that. It's not just that Batman takes on and tangles with and fights Ronald Reagan's henchman, who is Superman. It's also that the entire graphic novel functions as a kind of response to the political or cultural moment that Reagan was a part of, that he engineered. So if we go into our way back machines, part of what you might remember or know about the 1970s is that there were a number of crises, that there were a number of injuries or national traumas. Night in and night out, Richard Nixon was turned into a joke on American television. In the top right-hand corner, that's the Iran hostage crisis, 444 days. The news would count down in the upper right corner how long those hostages had been taking place. This particular very disturbing image of the Vietnam War, where America had brought a number of injuries to that particular country. And then finally, there was a kind of economic crisis that was running through. And that Nixon left office. There was Gerald Ford who took over. Jimmy Carter suggested that the United States was at a kind of crossroads. And then Ronald Reagan, 1984, picks up on the language that started with Gerald Ford, saying the national nightmare is over. So all those nightmares have been put behind us. And Ronald Reagan in 1984, as part of his re-election campaign, says, it's morning again in America. It's morning again in America. And these are stills here on the right-hand side. These are stills from the ad campaign that was so popular for Ronald Reagan. It's morning again in America, waking up to a brand new day, putting behind them all that national nightmare that I had on the previous slide, all those national injuries. And here's why I think that's important, is because one of the ideas in The Dark Knight Returns is that those injuries are not surmountable. There is no waking up from those nightmares. It is a night that returns again and again and again for Batman as he returns to that street corner on which his parents were killed. Sorry, spoiler alert. Should I say spoiler alert there? As he returns night in and night out on that street corner where his parents were killed. So there is a kind of way to understand The Dark Knight Returns as a political or cultural allegory, an antidote to the kind of sunshiny optimism of Ronald Reagan, and an acknowledgement that those traumas that exist behind us are not insurmountable. Bruce Wayne is the kind of man that, well, he's the kind of man that the 1980s taught people to like. He was rich, he was white, he was straight, he had all his resources available to him, but what he could not get over was the pain of returning to that street corner. Well, that originary moment, it could have happened yesterday. Here he is on that street corner, thinking about how his parents died. It is yesterday. He can't get beyond those pains or those traumas in his past, even though that is something explicitly that Ronald Reagan always encouraged Americans to do, especially in his 1984 ad campaign. So that's more about the culture. I think an extended version, I might talk more about Ferris Bueller and how Ferris Bueller is really Ronald Reagan, trying to shake off a malaise of people like, what's his friend's parent? What's his friend's name? You'll all correct me in a moment. His friend, his sort of malaise that his friend's parents represent. Instead, Ferris Bueller has all his resources, space and time and money available to him. But Bruce Wayne, Batman, is not Ferris Bueller, is not Ronald Reagan, and The Dark Knight Returns is a kind of political allegory that responds to the cultural optimism of 1980s Ronald Reagan. I'm going to take a deep breath here, and I think that's where I'd like to end this portion of the talk. But the wonderful thing about comics and talking about comics is that people always have questions. People always want to talk more about comics, and I'm happy to talk about what's here. I'm happy to share with you what I know about comics, or ask you and carry on a conversation about what you know about comics. But I think I'll turn it over to Kat, or how do you want to handle this part? Do we just open for questions here, Kat?
Yeah, we can do that. We can open it up for questions. That's usually what we do. And then basically what we have done is just encourage anybody who has a question, raise your hand, or and then if you have a question you want to put in the chat, go for it, and then one of us will read it out to you. So if anybody has a question, go.
Yeah, that was great. That was great, Joel. So one of us will watch the chat, and one of us will kind of look for hands and go from there. So yeah, Cameron, that was his name.
That's it, Cameron. Yes, he's so good in Succession. I hope you're all watching Succession.
I couldn't get through it.
Oh yeah.
Evil.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
All right, I'm looking for.
Got a quick question just to start us off. Apologize, I don't know why it's not pinning me, but I will just do that and then remove myself after. You mentioned in 1954 the comics code. This is more just like a passing question, you don't have to expand on it, but was that applicable when they were releasing Watchmen? Because Watchmen was really gruesome and it didn't adhere to any of the rules that you had mentioned. I'm just wondering how they made it around that.
I think to be fair, and I probably positioned in my talk as if Frank Miller was the only one ever doing it. I think there were a number of authors who were starting to challenge the comics code subtly, inch by inch, right? But Frank Miller really took aim at it by putting Ronald Reagan right at the middle of it, and so too did Watchmen, right? I mean, Watchmen does or make some of those same violations of the comics code, and by that time they were selling too well and too importantly for anyone to dismiss or for it to be meaningful a meaningful stopgap or a meaningful mechanism for policing in any way. So it existed at that time almost in name only. But it's one of the remarkable things I think about that Daredevil cover. It's a sign of what was happening in the culture, or at least in comic books, that they were refusing to obey the Comics Code Authority that was apparently there to police them.
Elizabeth has a question. What do you think about Frank Miller's politics re DKR? You can expand if you want, Elizabeth, or we'll just let that one sit there with Joel.
Yeah. Elizabeth, if you're able to, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you mean about Frank Miller's politics about DKR. Because he does.
Hi, Joel.
How are you? I'm good. How are you?
Good. So I don't have, it's using my speaker. So after Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller wrote some pretty gross stuff.
Yeah.
One of them being some, I would say, Islamophobic, some, racist comics, really. So I guess, kind of, how do you apply that, now when you're looking at Dark Knight Returns?
Yeah. Well, what I've only given here is a snapshot of Frank Miller, right? And I've positioned him as a kind of political revolutionary, an anti-Ronald Reagan. But there are also moments, as you're pointing out, in his writings before and after, in his interviews, where he says some obviously and conspicuously objectionable things. And I would just point out some of that there are contradictions here. And I think I'm less familiar with some of the racist things that he says, but more in terms of the ways in which Frank Miller manages sexuality and gender in The Dark Knight Returns. So one of the things that Frank Miller does is that he makes Robin a girl. So even as insistent as Frank Miller is in objecting to Ronald Reagan's culture of optimism, he is also, in that case, incredibly conservative, I don't know if obeying the Comics Code or reforming to stick within the Comics Code, so that there is a kind of straight relationship between Robin and Batman. No need to look here. It's not suspicious or worrying at all. We might think that the comic tries to speak to some of its more conservative readers. In fact, the last line in the last panel of The Dark Knight Returns is "Straighten up, Robin," right? Encouraging Robin to be straight all of a sudden. And that flies in the face of a history of, yes, the queerness of the Joker too, of acknowledging too, there's sort of winks and nudges and innuendos that runs throughout all of comic book history when we think of Batman and Robin. I'm going to share my screen one more time. I have them in another slide deck here, just so you too. Whoops, if I can. Whoops. Oh, it's because I haven't stopped the presentation mode here yet. So there we go. You're all very patient. Thank you very much. Share one more time. Share here. I think this is the slide deck I'm looking for. Yeah. So this is also in The Dark Knight Returns. It's the spirits, I suspect, that makes one overly sentimental. Dick Grayson has died, right? And there's long moments here in the graphic novel where Bruce Wayne spends a long time, panel after panel, walking around bemoaning the loss of his friend Dick Grayson. Whoops, here's the slides that I'm looking for. So you can see this sort of unease. This is the ways in which comic books have acknowledged the queer history between Batman and Robin. Gosh, what'll become of me now? the discomfort with straight relationships. Just Bruce and Dick waking up together. So this is sort of the closeted Bruce Wayne, right? It's hidden in plain sight. It's the kind of closet that he was stuffed into. You can see how enthusiastic Robin is with his plan of attack here.
That's more than innuendo.
Yeah. Yeah. Some of it's super explicit, right?
Yeah.
It's like, what about these guys? Right. So it's a kind of comic book history that Frank Miller, Elizabeth, this goes back to your question, that Frank Miller wanted to ignore or straighten out instead of amplifying it. You could think of another kind of queer reading of Batman and Robin that amplifies some of these aspects of their relationship, but instead it becomes something to be ignored, or at least masked, changed. And I think we have to, these texts are always complex and never one thing. And so there's often these tensions between the political revolution that we're talking about, but also its racist origins, as you might be thinking about, or also, in this case, the ways in which it supplants or overwrites a queer history that's possible, that's hidden in plain sight elsewhere in these texts.
And that sort of gets at Iateo's question, which was how did they get around policing or censorship, open resistance, subversive text or humor? I mean, I think partly that flows right from where you just were, Joel, around, you know, is it innuendo? Is it hidden in plain sight? And can you really call someone on that when they're like, no, I was just showing two guys who are buddies?
Yeah,
like how?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it. It's by way of irony or by way of innuendo that that you're allowed to get around some of those issues. But also, I think what Teo's pointing out to is one of the reasons why the Comics Book Authority or the Comics Code Authority there was a kind of fatigue in policing it by the 1980s. Invented in the 1950s, laws are only as good as they're willing to be enforced, right? That's why the speed limit on the 401 is not 100, it's really 120. Right? I'm not encouraging anyone to go super fast, but that's why it is, because nobody is really going to enforce a speed limit below that. But by the 1980s, there's a kind of fatigue because they've been pushing the envelope every little bit, every year, every issue. Salacious one moment becomes accepted or acceptable the next, right? So Peter Parker, holding a needle full of drugs in his hand is acceptable at one moment, salacious at one moment. It's commonplace 2 or 3 years down the road.
Yeah. There's a question in here. This one's a little off topic, but Mitchell wondered, and then I'm going to get to Shannon's. Mitchell wondered if you have heard of Nelvana of the Northern Lights.
Oh, yes, I have. But this is the strange thing. I have done less research in Canadian superheroes than I have in American or Canadian comic books than I have with American comic books. And maybe that's because I was looking for that kind of diversion away from most of my work, which has been based in Canadian literature. Mitch, what's your familiarity with Nelvana?
I hate to say, I saw it on Netflix, I think, comic background about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, wow, this is an indigenous character. Yeah. And so fascinating, worthy of looking into more.
Yes. Yeah. And I know someone who's, she used to be at, where did she used to be? I think in Vancouver. Now she's at Thompson Rivers University. Brenda Clark Gray does a lot of writing on Canadian comic books. And she's done a lot of work there, but I'll admit that that's a kind of blind spot for me, which I say a little ashamedly, but also a little proudly, I have to say, because so much of my work has been in Canadian literature that I have found this to be a really nice distraction, because I get to think about another culture in a different way. But you're right. There's a lot there that is is ripe for study. Another archive hidden in plain sight.
Mm-hmm. Shannon took us on another path, which was an unrelated question. The street gang that becomes almost like followers of Batman in the Dark Knight Returns / Strikes Again series. Would you say they might represent the American people who might have been in favor of Reagan?
This is my thinking phase, Shannon. I'm sure you probably remember it. I would say that graphic novel is very much about followership, right? There are large portions about this group that at one time, for those of you who have not read it, follows the bad guy in book 2, the mutant warrior, and then they start painting their faces to look like Batman, and they become Batman followers. I'd have to think a little bit more about that. If we could draw a kind of a clear line and make them part of that allegory, or what part of the allegory they serve. I'll have to think about that a little bit more, Shannon. I wish I had a firmer answer there, but there is something about followership and fandom that I think is really interesting. And I sometimes read that or think about those followers of Batman as a commentary on fan cultures. I mean, one of the things that's happening at this time in the comic book industry is the mode of distribution is shifting. So rather than being able to go down to your corner store, what a 7-Eleven, a Max Milk, a mom and pop convenience store, where they'd have sort of racks and racks of comic books, and you'd get the monthly issue. The mode of distribution started to change, and so you'd have fewer opportunities to buy in situations like that, more opportunities to buy from specialty stores, like, well, here, I live and work in Toronto, the Silver Snail or the Beguiling, for instance, these kind of specialty stores that were only devoted to selling comics. And the reason why that mattered is because that created a kind of fandom, right? A fandom where someone could not just read the most recent issue, but go through and look at all the back issues. And so they now had not just an understanding of Batman, that issue that came out this week, but they had an understanding of the back history and the back catalog of Batman. So they're creating a different kind, a more knowledgeable fan by changing the mode of distribution of comic books. And I think about that shift a lot when I think about, well, Netflix, right? And what's happening with WandaVision and Disney Plus, allowing people to go back over and rethink. We're watching that particular story in a different way. It's less plot driven and more it's more of an archive of ideas as it reorients that particular story. Or I think about, say, what Netflix does to a show like Friends, for example, where we're binging shows now rather than watching. My kids won't watch shows that have commercials in them anymore. It's like, why would we ever do that in an old-timey way, right? Give me something I can fast forward. Go ahead, Melanie.
Well, I was going to say, plus people rewatch a lot of those shows. Like my kids rewatched things like The Office and Friends, and we reread comic books over and over and over again. So when you said that just made me think, oh gosh, like I thought it was weird that they rewatched episodes, but actually it isn't if you think about how we looked at comic books and read and reread them. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. Can we have a show of hands of who is a comic book reader? You can do your little hand on the regular world, or like who reads them?
I'll share. I read less the superhero or the everyday issues, but I read a lot of graphic novels now. I'll show you my favorite one right now. This is my favorite at the moment. Elizabeth, you recognize this. Oops, where am I? Yeah, my favorite thing is Monsters. And so this is by Emil Ferris. And all these pictures in here, I don't know if I'll find a good one to share with you. They're all pen. And it's a really beautiful and moving story about a little girl trying to solve a murder mystery who shows up in the text as a werewolf, but tries to uncover the kind of mystery that's happening in her own house. It's very much aware of entertainment comics, EC comics like Tales of the Crypt, and sort of uses that vocabulary to explain the situation of this particular girl.
Okay, I have one question before I go to Kat's long one, which I'm going to make Kat read because it's a long one. I don't know how this happened, but when I was a kid, my grandmother had all these comic books in the attic, and they were my dad's and my uncle's comic books. So they were much older than what I would have been normally reading at my age. In the 70s, I was reading comic books from the 50s. And my like, I'll admit it right here, I don't love comic books. I don't really get it, but I reread and obsessed over the Dale Evans and Roy Rogers ones. There were all these cowboy comic books, and I have not really ever seen them since that box from my grandmother's house from the 1950s. What happened to them? They were the best. They had desert scenes and a lot of stallions riding through, tumbleweed going by. And what happened? What happened to the Western comics?
Yeah, well, they go in phases, right? And I'm not sure what happened to the Western comics in particular, but we might think about the particular superhero moment that we're in, right? 19 movies from Marvel, at least 19 movies, I think, in Marvel since 2008, which is an incredible rate of production. But at one time, cowboy movies were similarly popular in the 1970s. So this too will fade. It's a phase or a fad or a moment that's trying to sustain itself, but it's only as popular as it was then. But I'm not sure what happened to those particular comics, but there were Buck Rogers comics and Terry the Pirate comics at the same time that Dick Tracy and Batman were being detectives. There were these more outlandish adventures in the 1940s and the 1950s.
And I don't know why I liked the cowboy stuff better, but I did also love the Dale Evans one, because Dale Evans was a girl riding on a horse, kicking some butt, and nobody, that was kind of inspirational to me, which made me think about, I didn't think about Little Orphan Annie as pro-Reagan. That's scary, but the fact that she was a girl is interesting to me. But anyway, I should go to Kat's question. But Dale Evans, if you ever see a 1950s Dale Evans comic book, short hair, white cowboy hat, riding around with, it's great. Go ahead, Kat.
Hi, sorry, I just thought I'd add on to that as from what Mel's just saying before I quickly go to my question. I remember as a kid, I read a lot of comic books, all the different ones like Marvels, and my mom's in the background, she's nodding her head. But so all the Marvel comic books and the DC comic books, but all the superheroes, but also when I got older, I realized that there were a lot of kind of storyline ones as well. So there was ones like Amulet that had a female lead. There's a really long book. It's around 300 to 400 pages, and it's called Lighter Than My Shadow, and it's this story about this woman who explores her experience within an eating disorder, and it shows so many different aspects of comics, because we are traditionally interpreted as just superheroes, and I find it so interesting. Mel, you brought up the westerns and everything. It's such a widespread genre, and so that being said, I guess I could kind of tie it in to what I'm trying to say here. So my question originally was, I apologize if you've already explained this a little bit, but has there ever been an explanation, or at least collective fan base opinion, on why they continuously hinted at the interpretations of Batman's sexuality without explicitly stating it? Because I think it kind of triggered that question in my brain when you were saying that Batman's this what everybody wanted to appreciate, the straight white male intended, but is it kind of doing a hint as everything's not always as it seems, everything's not always that it's constantly presented it as, there's always stories behind. So I'm just wondering if there's ever been an acknowledgement of that.
Well, authors would acknowledge it, right? So one series of authors writes that acknowledgement in that Robin's really worried, and then another author picks up on it, and there's sort of a nudge wink wink to the audience. But there's also a fear of being explicit, or at least coming out of that particular comic book closet. I think for fear of reprisal from its readers, or the ways in which that text or that queer relationship, that gay relationship, would be received. And so instead, it's sustained by those kinds of offhand remarks, or those innuendos, or those more explicit, which when you isolate them in a single panel, it looks very explicit. When it's one panel of 6 on a page with 40 pages in a particular text, it goes by quite quickly. Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, yep. and it just keeps going. Instead, we come to realize that these characters that seem familiar to us are flexible in a lot of ways. And they're screens onto which we can project our fantasies and anxieties and our hopes, our preoccupations. And the job of a really good writer, I think, is to keep those open, right? Or at least the reason why a lot of these texts stay popular is because they can sustain multiple and sometimes contradictory interpretations, right?
That's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Elizabeth, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just to Kat's point about other comics, this is what I'm doing my thesis on, and I highly recommend reading it right now. It's called Bitch Planet, and it's a dystopia. And you know, reading this right now, kind of in the time of, you know, dealing with racial injustice and the abolition movement, it's incredible. And then also there's this one as well. It's called This Place. It's 150 years retold, and this is Indigenous history of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in comic book form, graphic novel form, and it's all done by Canadian, you know, Indigenous people of Canada, and looking at communities and cultures since Confederation. So. And then I have another one on Black Panther history as well. So they're really doing all kinds of stuff with comics. That was it.
That's awesome. That's so exciting.
Yeah, I mean, Black Panther's so interesting to raise too, because one of the reasons why it was revived, and this was before the movie, was it was written by, revived by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is a well-known author, thinker in the United States, MacArthur Fellow, I think, Genius MacArthur, the Genius Grant, whatever, I can't remember what organization gives the Genius Grants out. He received one a number of years ago. He writes a lot about reparations in the United States. But also, and also he calls Obama the last Black president, right? So writes really movingly and really well about the Obama years. But he turned to comic books afterwards, right? And he turned to comic books to revive Black Panther. But also then he said, I'm going to write the whitest superhero and write the story for the whitest superhero. So first he started writing Captain America, and I saw that it was just announced that he's writing Superman with a J.J. Abrams movie, because what he talks about, and this was in an interview with Colbert about a year ago, I think, he talks about comic books as being a kind of a way to address some of these political ideas in a more palatable form for a large audience. I'm sure Scott might have some ideas on fandom and political content and why some of these texts get received and celebrated and circulated. But I thought it was interesting the ways in which he recognized almost immediately the political aspects of comic books and the way in which they can carry forward.
I'm just going to go to Craig for a quick second, because I asked Saphira and Sam what they watch, and Craig said, "Oh, I'll make a quick comment there." But I saw the comment from that Saphira's into the history comic books, which, as a historian, I'm like, woohoo, historical comic books, that's great. Craig, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Joel. That was wonderful. I appreciate you sharing your time today. I was actually going to pull Scott in a bit. Sam made an observation. I am dragging him through the 80s. I'm reliving my youth through him, as does happen.
And I'm enjoying it.
He's enjoying it. So at any rate, you know, I'm very interested in some of the stuff that you raised, Joel, around this. I see it as a backlash to conservatism that sort of came through Reagan again in the 80s, and sort of this Horatio Alger idea of you know, the dream can be realized, that seems to resurface. And I see that within comic books through my readings as well, and sort of a rebellion against that. But what Sam pointed out is he saw a video from Genesis back in the 80s, which was one of those spitting image. I don't know if you remember those from the 80s, the puppets they used in England. Scott would be familiar with them. And there was a line in there, you know, around Superman can't save us now. And, you know,
Superman,
Reagan hitting the button. And
from Land of Confusion, and the video had the caricature of Reagan in it. So I thought maybe that illustrates that same connection between Reagan and Superman that you were talking about from the comics.
Yeah, and brings up also the music. There was a whole bunch of, labeling that came out, Tipper Gore, and the same parallel with music, which I think Scott would probably see some of those connections as well against censorship, right?
Scott, do you want to jump in here?
Oh, there's a lot going on. I agree with Sam's kind of analysis. Like I was always a Marvel guy when I read comics in the 70s and 80s, and I always thought they were more socially conscious. The characters were more fully developed. And I always found DC, like if I was going to put them into American parties, I mean, Marvel was the Democrats and DC were the Republicans, and they sort of had through their heroes those kinds of affinities. Even though I kind of had liked Batman, I was always more the campy 60s Batman, kind of growing up with that TV show and what it was doing with that kind of superhero genre. But I kind of agree with that kind of rise of the 80s, the kind of idealism around, America, the questions about it. There's a real crisis of conscience in 80s America when you kind of have a generation that had been the 60s hippies who have now become the 80s yuppies. And there's a lot of films made at the time with, I kind of call them, I think I stole it from a review, but comedies of yuppie angst. And it was always these characters who were confronting the fact that suddenly they become these Reaganite Wall Street types, but they had some sort of edgy side from their past that they wanted to revisit. And that really, it appears in the comics as well. I think that rise of those comics, and then the Tipper Gore stuff is an interesting corollary. I was thinking of that too, because, the music business did it then with their kind of stickers. The comics code had done it. The film industry had done it with the Hays Code back in the 1920s. And they were all voluntary, right? They were all industry led because it was a means of keeping politicians and others out of their business. So they kind of established those codes. And, early 60s, the rise of, international cinema and independent cinema kind of made the Hays Code irrelevant. People were flocking to films that had far more interesting content than anything that Hollywood was churning out. And by 86, I think Joel's right, the kind of rise of independent comics and someone like Alan Moore coming out of, writing for 2000 AD in Britain, writing in independent comics and writing very strong women characters. I think, he really called Miller out for his misogyny in his work. And Moore was really interested. Like Ballad of Halo Jones is, really kind of strong, innovative character that he developed in 2000 AD. So it was, those independent comics allowed for these other expressions, this kind of almost counterculture that became, more dominant and kind of made the codes irrelevant. But I don't know if that's the answer to what you're asking, Craig. But.
Sorry, I sit right beside the printer at home, so what you can hear is just somebody has sent something to print, and this is what you get to enjoy when you're in one of my classes. You get to hear the printer every so often.
Non-stop action. Okay, I'm going to just ask Harriet's question, and then I think we might wrap up and let Kat talk a bit about next week, because that came up in the chat. Okay, so Harriet asked about the desire, well, really the question is, will the graphic novel inspire children to read as the J.K. Rowling books have done, or minimize the legitimacy of so-called traditional novels and thoughts? I mean, I think, before I go to Joel, I think lots of people would say the depth of what's happening in graphic novels, will equal a non-graphic novel. But I know even for my own son, reading Robin Hood, but in a graphic novel form, was way more exciting for him than reading Robin Hood without the pictures, especially when kids are grappling with reading. And I think it helped. I actually think it turns them into reading in the same way that an e-bike can turn someone into a cyclist. They're not necessarily a bad crutch. They get you on the path, but that's my opinion, which I shouldn't be giving. So I'll turn to Joel for that one.
I was going to tell a similar anecdote, right, about graphic novels and or comic books. Let's start there. And I think that the term graphic novel is really interesting, right, because that was sort of half invented when Will Eisner, when he writes, I've lost the title of his particular book in early 1970s, that it was the first time that the word graphic novel was used in publishing. Now, it sort of circulated in some little magazines ahead of time, some industry magazines, but someone said, well, why should we publish? I think it was called A Testament to God. Why should we publish this and how should we sell it? He said, well, don't call it a comic book, call it a graphic novel, because he had heard that term before, and that's how it sort of changed the way bookshelves operate in bookstores. But nowadays, when we talk about graphic novel, what we're really talking about are really complex or sophisticated texts, right? And the challenge is less, are they overwriting or distracting students from novels, and more so, how can we help students read visually complex visual and verbal texts, right? So when I have students in my comics book classes or in my graphic novel classes, we spend a lot of time just learning how to read pictures, right? Which sounds strange, but you have to teach. The tendency for an English major, Kat, you would well know, is probably to pay attention to the words on the page, right? Where I spend some time erasing the words on a page and helping the students understand the kind of formal or visual vocabulary that a lot of these texts are speaking to us with. And I think that's the real challenge. We're just not so much distracting them from quote unquote real reading or of traditional novels, but they're very much a different kind of reading that still asks students to ask, or children, that all important question, so what? So what's important about the way that character is constructed? Or so what's captivating or exciting about that character's adventures that turn into other longer questions about, that we would tackle in a university class.
Thank you so much, Joel.
And thank you, Harriet. That's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I worried, I must admit, I was like, my son doesn't like reading. What am I going to do with him? And then and my husband, who teaches young children in schools, said anything they read, it's the back of the cereal box, it's the jar of peanut butter, it doesn't matter. If your kid's looking at words and finding the story in that, then you're fine. And he tells parents that all the time as a teacher. So that's great. And I don't mean that that's minimizing the comic either. I just think reading is good in all ways. Thank you, Joel. My little speech bubble is saying thank you for connecting all of that for us and bringing us into a really great world. I'm going to look more carefully I'm going to try and find my grandmother's comics, to be honest, to see where they are, because I might have to go back. As always, we do a different topic every week. We always get dragged into something fascinating. Really loved it. Thanks for being part of Enwayaang, and thanks for the Durham connection. It was great to have Durham on the screen with Gzowski. Great partnership. So thanks everyone for coming. Kat has shared the little quick poll, and it's just a quick second for you. And Kat, can you just tell us what's coming up next week before we say goodbye?
Yeah, of course. I mentioned this I'm going to pin myself again. I don't know why it's not doing that automatically. Hello. Just coming up next week, as I said, we do this every single week. We have a different speaker. We have passionate people coming on in. Next week, we have Kemi Akapo, and the topic is, it's all about relationships in Wakanda forever. And it's really going to tie into that whole community aspect and thankfully they're right in a row, and we're going to tie in some comic books and Wakanda and all of the societal aspects of that. So if you guys are interested in it, I would highly suggest you come out next week as well.
And that's a great thing on the week of International Women's Day. And Kemi is a local powerhouse city councilor, works at the New Canadian Centre, and a Trent alum. So hope you join us. Thanks again, Joel. We really appreciate your time. We know you're busy, and that was super entertaining and informative as well.
Well, really happy to be here. Nice to see you all. Nice to see your faces and your names, and so glad to have such a wonderful group here. We're all busy. I'm glad to have you take the time to be here today. Thanks for inviting me, Melanie and Kat and Stephanie. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Bye-bye.